My name is Benedict for Higher Hertz. In this video we're looking at UAD's Waterfall Rotary. Pretty recent release. My understanding that it is designed to complement the Waterfall B3 organ emulation that they have. I have never tried their B3 emulation. I considered downloading it for this, but I thought no, they talk about how Rotary is useful on everything, so let's test it in a more real-world situation where we whack this on various synth sounds in our DAW and see what happens. Now this is what it looks like. This is how it sounds. Finally found my resolution there. As you can tell, I'm not really anybody's keyboard player, let alone a B3 player. There's an absolute art in playing a B3. Let's have a little bit of a look through. We will go through the walkthrough of the product in a moment, but initially we'll walk through applying this to various different types of sounds and showing you what it does, and then we will look at how it does it. So if we close this down, we have here a very typical simplistic emulation of a Hammond B3 or rock organ type sound. In this case we've only got 3 tone wheels running, or 3 partials, so a fundamental and a couple of overtones mixed to suit. There's no right or wrong there. A little bit of noise or thump on the front, and a little bit of movement because Hammond B3s, unless perfectly maintained, were always somewhat imperfect, part of the charm of their sound. Once synths started to get on board effects, it was pretty common that they would come with a rock organ type sound, and you'd have a process something like this. Now, while that is actually surprisingly usable, especially on stage, it covers the theory and the overt feel of a Leslie being the name of the inventor of the rotary cabinet, but it doesn't really nail it. It's good, it's cool, like I said, great for a stage, but doesn't quite cut it if we want to be very fussy and pedantic on record. So there's been a push always for this kind of ability to emulate the true uniqueness and stunning mess of the sound that is made by these rotary cabinets. And at least on the surface, this does this surprisingly well. So that is cool. Just as a comparison, here's Rotor, which is from Propeller Heads. Obviously, they are not necessarily emulating each other exactly, but roughly the same sort of sound. But there is a different feel to the UAD Waterfall. It is perhaps a little smoother and warmer than Rotor, but Rotor is designed with a broader sense of ability to move from here to there. And my understanding is everything in Rotor is algorithmic. In other words, it is bits and pieces of code, whereas my assumption here is that a lot of this is probably done with impulse responses. It has that feel to it, and that's good and great if that's the way you like things to be, but perhaps a little bit more limited in terms of, you see, there are very few rotaries here in the ability to move from here to there. But then a B3's Leslie cabinet was also fairly limited in what you could do on the cabinet itself. It was basically set it to go, and it went, as long as it was not broken and was reasonably set up. A lot of the off-board stuff was done off-board. So just slightly different paradigms in how we approach things. And of course they've said to us that we can use this for lots of other things. Naturally, they want to sell more copies, so they're going to tell us you can apply your rotary speaker to anything and get amazing results. To some extent, yes. To some extent, no. Oh, just as a little bit of housekeeping, if you haven't already noticed, we've got a little bit of reverb coming in here, courtesy of Hertz delay, just to give a consistent sense of room. That is whacked into the masters. It's more noticeable on this bass sound. That makes it easier to listen to and more realistic in terms of how something's likely to sound in the mix. So we have a very typical VA bass sound being played through an arpeggiator. It does do interesting things to the sound. Sure doesn't make it bassier, but we could, in theory, rebalance here. On how we want to balance things out. So it's interesting. It's not a this is going to do everything for you. We can put it into the slow mode. We've then got violins. Courtesy of BBC SO. And if we whack a rotary on those. And while it's a really rather cool sound, big shades of something like Moody Blues or ELO, it still screams rotary speaker. That's not a bad thing. It's quite cool, evocative, Mellotron-y, and definitely goes a fair way. Ooh, missing notes. Definitely goes a fair way towards separating this from being just another string sample slathered on top of things. So it is nice in that sense. Definitely a doable thing. Then we've got this fellow. So an FM Synth Pad, which is pretty hard and brittle already, as is the nature of such things. We can change our balance here, which just makes it sound more like an organ in the first place. But synths are prone to all sounding like organs in the first place. More real-world material, a little less so. But I've deliberately gone with all synth type stuff in here. So it's interesting. You can take a sound that maybe you don't feel sitting comfortably in a mix, and you can try a rotary on it. Just be aware that every time you put a rotary on it, it's going to sound like a processed B3 organ. That could be good, that could be bad. And then old synth trumpet. In this case, I've got the horn not rotating. So we're just looking at, well, what does the tube amp that they tell us is amazeful do? It has a very definite sound to it. And I think it does add a very different character to this trumpet. Makes it sound more trumpety, but brass is a common thing that is put through distortion to make it sound more trumpety. So here it's got a stringy sound, giving away synth brassness. There it's got a more metallic kind of a sound, which shifts it away from the, oh, that's a synthesizer, into a, I'm not sure what that is. We'll probably come to the conclusion that it is going to be a synthesizer. But it does create a more distinctive tone that's less obviously, oh, you've got a synthesizer. But just be careful, if you process something too hard like this, as many modern people do with their records to try to prove how much they don't have a synthesizer, you just make a sound that's weird and seems less natural, less comfortable in its own setting than the actual synthesizer would have in the first place. I hear so many records where there are just sounds that are just like lots and lots of drive on them to try to prove how cool they are and how not like a synthesizer it sounds, and it's like, it's just awful. It sounds uncomfortable. But then if you're appealing to that kind of buyer who thinks that's the coolest thing ever, then I guess that's probably what you should do. It's between you and your God and your fans, of course. But it is an interesting result. For every situation, probably not. But they are reasonable, UAD are reasonable where they say you can apply this to everything and get something interesting. Broadly speaking, correct. Uber accuracy, yeah, maybe not quite as much, because everything's going to tend to sound like it's been put through a rotary speaker, as is the nature of putting things through a rotary speaker. So again, that's through the UAD, that's through rotor. Let's get rid of rotor. UAD and price. Well, UAD is UAD is UAD. If you want to know a little bit more, I spoke about them in the review of their Spark, all of their bits and pieces in a month-by-month payment sort of a situation. UAD have managed to lever themselves into being a big name in the business, in certain part from their hardware background. Good on them, fair enough. I do believe, though, that as a hardware company and as a software company, they are paddling different canoes, shall we say. They are obviously in business to make the most amount of money that they can. Fair enough, that is the nature of being in business. But you need to work out where that line moves from what we might call grasping at large amounts of money versus providing a very high quality product. Now, people are going to debate about whether this is or isn't a high quality product, and people are going to want to scream at me. It's like, but you don't know anything. Okay, it's up to you. As I said all along, this is up to you. They've got millions of plugins, and okay, fair enough. Some of them, or most of them, probably sound great in their own right. But my concern, and the reason that I don't go for them, is that largely they're each a little one-trick pony, and ultimately they all kind of have the same process in mind. They clearly seem to have the same mindset in mind, which is of existing to break in cash. Now, again, you can say, well, Benedict, that's the nature of capitalism. Everything exists to rake in cash. You grow potatoes so that you can get cash, so that you can buy goats to eat. Yes, I have no argument with that at all. But there's a difference between growing a very high-quality potato, selling a very nice, clean product, or growing a low-quality potato but selling it as though it's a high-quality potato, as though it's a fulfilling, healthful potato. And you need to decide where you sit on that thing. With UAD, I unfortunately feel like their potatoes are a little starchy and lacking in yumfulness, ultimately, despite the fact that they seem very impressive on the surface. In terms of price, the usual cheap discount, blah, 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 for entry. It looks like they're prone to having discounts all over the place, unless Opal has suddenly come into the native, as in it'll run as a normal VST without having to have their hardware. They've rolled back their hardware requirements. But €108, 200 and something, which is too small for me to read. It's a lot of money. It's an absolute lot of money. I can't remember what I paid for Rotor, but I think it might have been $49, $59 US. So a euro is going to translate, 108 is going to translate to about 165 Australian dollars. What the 49 or what, 50 or so dollars US translates to, let's say it was 75 or something like that. It's not a cheap product. So yes, again, I question, is it something that's presented as a premium potato that somehow is better than every other potato, when in actual fact it's at best the same as every other potato, or maybe just got a big hole in the middle? You're going to have to decide that. It's definitely impressive on first impact. Righto, the nitty-gritty of it is where we walk through the device and get used to what it does. Actually, no, before we do this, we will go through my good and bad, and then you can confirm or deny based upon as we go through the walkthrough. What's good is there is an immediate recognizable Leslie sound, perhaps more so than most other contenders. But as you hear, the difference between this and Propeller Heads or Reason Studios Rotary was minimal, and in a mix, is anyone going to know or care? I don't know. If you're one of those people that feels that you can only have an amazeful record if you have a real emulation of a real B3 with a real rotary, then great, that's your ball. But it does sound good out of the box. It's arrestingly good, but that I find to be the nature of all impulse responses, that are immediately very arresting and then a little limited down the track, which is part of why I believe these are IRs, and also I just think it's the nature of the beast to be using a lot of IRs these days. It has different mic options. Its only real sound changing emulations is through these mic options, which we will look at later. But again, I feel like all of these mics are just IRs. So you're putting an IR through an IR with 3 or 4 different sets of permutations of said IRs. Okay, fair enough. It makes it simple, it makes it immediately wow, but there's nowhere in between, because IRs are like that. Yes, you can warp them, but they tend to sound even stranger the more you warp them, as is the nature of these things, because to me, as I always say, an IR is like putting bunny ears on yourself in an Instaham picture. It does not turn you into a rabbit. So there are options and a certain amount of versatility in the sound before you get to your own outboard processing. But oddly enough, there's no bypass of any of these IRs. There's no, that I can see, mix or ability to bypass this to just listen to this. You're still going to have the mic things. And I know some people can go, oh, but that's self-evident because that's how the machine worked. And it's like, yes, I agree with you in the sense that there was no jack on the side of one of these things to, like an electric guitar. You had to mic them before you could actually put them on a record. But it's not 1974 anymore. Seeing this is all virtual, this is all pretend, then why can we not tap this without having to hear the speaker and microphone IRs? Why not? Why not give me that option? The bad. Well, there's a huge amount of wasted space on here. Just a huge amount. And this to me says a lot about the approach. And I know this is very common in the industry and it's appealing to those who want to buy fantasy. Sorry, a little too blunt. This is an opinion piece, therefore it will have my opinion. Is that we've got these great big pictures in here which really aren't doing anything other than making us pretend that we feel and therefore hear a certain something. And then there are other controls which are so tiny that they're very hard to see. I do discover that we can change size of things, but again, it's just enormous, taking a massive amount of real estate for reasons that my take is on playing with people's feelings rather than actually providing a on-tape result. So I feel like the whole thing is a carrot being dangled in front of me to lead me places which don't necessarily result in being where I would want to go or where my song wants to go. So I think that they are, playing with our fancies far more than helping us make music. It does turn out that there's a little control in here. Wow! So hidden controls, things are just, not as easy to use as they should be, but they look very pretty and very emotively engaging. That's off-putting for me. That says to me this isn't about my abilities to work with this as an engineer. This is about making me feel all kinds of... I'm not interested in that. I'm not some kind of woke hipster. There is also no input trim. This appears to work on the assumption that we all run at -18, like some good children. Sometimes it felt like it just really got out of hand with too hot a signal in the input. Fair enough. Absolutely fair enough. But seeing there's all this heinously wasted space, what's wrong with adding a input knob? We see, sir, that you have exceeded the golden rule of -18 dB. Let us suggest to you that you straighten up and fly right. Said in quotes for irony before somebody else wants to get real bent out of shape at me. I think, again, that's just like you've provided an output, an overall control of how loud we want things to be, but no way to control what hits the relatively drivey input. Again, it seems like style over substance. That's ultimately going to be the killer for me on these, why I'm not excited to take them into my world, but the very reason that most other people will take them into their world and fight tooth and nail about how amazeful they are, when they're telling everybody else in groups and forums how proful they are because they've got these amazeful plugins. It's a game. If you like the game, bully for you. It's very exciting. It makes you feel very special. Alrighty, now let's dig into this puppy and what it's got. So yes, we've got this massive interface with pictures of spinning things. And the animation's changed based upon what's happening. Yes, you can argue and say, but this helps people to understand what's going on inside the plugin. Yeah, I get that. I'm not entirely opposed to animations, but it just seems a little excessive when there are things that would have been more useful that have not been included or possibly deliberately omitted because they take away the feelings that the whole plugin is designed to do. It does turn out that there are a couple of settings in here. It does produce some noise when it's on. You can get rid of that. It was going to be a negative. It's like, there's some noise that's always there. Again, you can say, these things were always noisy. I bet they were absolute bastards for noise. But there is, once you find this, or if you are TFM, the ability to get rid of said noise, and you can also assign a MIDI controller to control this switch. At least I think it's this switch. I didn't actually assign a controller to it. Fair enough. We're dominated with, once we get over this big-ass picture, volume. Now, it's easy to think that this volume is the main output. No, it's actually not. It's the volume of the amplifier. They've got a tube amplifier emulation in here, and this is an emulated volume. Yes, it adds volume. It'd be almost kind of cool if it had added the emulation of the volume without adding volume, but I've got no argument with the fact that it adds the volume at the same time, because you probably kind of need to do the same thing. But they could have technically had a little button here that says we'll provide the results of said volume without providing the actual volume as well. Could have, should have, don't know, have no particular argument one way or another. It's just one of those things they could have done, but I think they decided not to do because then it would have messed up the classicness of the look. There's then a drive knob. And this is where we start to get into interesting territory. But notice how the drive is also influenced by the volume. So we can have drive up full, and the amount of distortion, ripfulness, is also driven very much by this. You've then got your output down the bottom. So if you're looking to go I want to sound like John Lord, and who doesn't want to sound like John Lord, then you are going to need to push the drive and push the volume. But you can also lower your drive, push your volume. So you've got various ways of balancing how you want to go. So if you're sort of half and half, you do get that nice, smooth, grindy burr, which a classic rock organ has. John Lord in a good mood. Controls. We can turn the rotary speakers off. We can put them into slow or fast, depending upon which feel we want. The fact that they have assigned a controller is good, because as I said at the beginning, the way a B3 is played often has a lot to do with the Leslie as well, and they have their switch on the side that you will see them switching in and out, and they will be switching that in and out in the middle of lines. So, like a mod wheel, only a little less elegant. There is a click. Let's look and see if this is part of the mechanical noise. Yes, it is. So that can go away. It's funny that it's only there in one situation. Maybe that's in a nature of the beast kind of thing, in which case some people would want it. But if you don't want it, you can get rid of it over there. So that's your 3 speed settings. So we've got the speed trims. This will change the speed of the horn and the speed of the drum. It's quite common, especially as these got a little out of trim, that the drum itself would move slower. And it's just endemic to the sound. And you get a slightly different sense of the beating in the sound, because we've got our Doppler shifts and what have you all working a little differently from each other. We can also change the acceleration and deceleration. So, see how that takes a bit to slow down? We can set it so that the horn should accelerate and decelerate much faster. See how that's quick? And the drum is a lot slower. We can flip that round the other way. It takes longer for the drum to get going. It takes longer for... Actually, no, the drum's getting going straight away. It's taking longer for the horn to slow down. So you can change those trims. That does exist, but it was quite common that the drum was actually a little bit slower. So if you're going, oh, well, that's too fast or too slow, you can have them set differently. So versatile, that's very much within the realms of how a B3 player plays. Obviously, I don't believe they can adjust those on the fly. Maybe they can, but play with those so that as you're switching things in and out, which you should be if you're really playing the Leslie as part of the instrument, then you might even automate those so that in the faster part of the piece you might speed up your accelerations, and in a slower part of the piece you might even drop the rate of your drum or your horn or whatever. So you've got a certain amount of versatility on the speeds of things, which is good. And then, of course, the overall on-off switch. It's up to you to level match the output. Most of the defaults do add a few dB. Understandable, but with an output knob, the fact that they don't seem to balance it, again, sort of one day in this modern day and age where everyone's, our DSP is so amazeful. It's like, ooh, so amazeful, it couldn't notice a gain of 2 dB. Okay, bit in the middle really does nothing. Then we've got our mic positioning. We've got mics for the top, so for the horn, and mics for the drum, the bottom bit. As I've indicated, everything works on Doppler shift. So we've got this horn that's, as you can see, there's a pair of horns, and as they come round, the speakers pick them up, and as they go off axis, obviously the tone and the pitching even changes, just based on the whole row of a passing car. The Doppler shift. It's obviously fairly fast here. So we can choose how we mic things. If we look just at the horn, because this is the real stereo bit of things, we can have it in mono. Now I was going to ping them for the fact that when you stop this, you can't control where it stops, because if it's in stereo, where it stops is often off to one side, but if and when you hit that issue, mic that in mono. Immediately popping this into the widest, fattest stereo you can find isn't always the wisest idea. It can cause you serious problems inside a mix if you've got other things going on. Let's say you're doing the so cliche classic of, or modern classic of taking your guitars and hard panning them, and you've got your B3 hard panned. Guess what? Your guitars and your B3 are both fighting with each other out here, in which case you're either going to do this in stereo and use something to narrow it down. I do hope your DAW has a pan narrowing thing, but I know most don't. Or just put it into mono. And that way you'll find your organ sits very neatly in the middle to give you a nice, more solid spread. Or you can pull your guitars in, God forbid that they be in the same boring position as everyone else's, and then use your organ to really create that big panorama. Though you've got... But again, I would just say, while this is all very technically accurate to mic positions, the problem is it's only 3 mic positions, which screams to me IR. When in reality we could actually put these anywhere, absolutely anywhere in the room. You know, we could have hung these down the coffee shop 14 miles away, and while that may not be the best mic positioning for this, we could. So this is limiting our options far more than the real world, and a digital emulation like the rotor that I quickly showed you there, it's got knobs. So we can control from a range of here to there. Okay, it doesn't go out to the coffee shop 14 kilometers away, but I can understand why not. If we really needed to do that, we could emulate that in the mixer. So 3 positions. I assume it's just because they only want to do so many recordings. Fair enough. And then for each position, you've got these different microphones. So if we've got 3 positions and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 microphones, it's 21 recordings, apparently. So a condenser, it's not a brand name, so some which is probably a 414, sounds like this. So they're just little differences in tone. Again, quite preset. And the same thing on the drum, except the drum is in mono. The drum is a speaker inside a drum with little gaps in it, so the sound can come out at that point. So you can mix and match whatever you like, but they don't have the same mics top and bottom. Well, at least not all of the same mics, top and bottom. Actually, no, the FET 7 is not iFET. Is not there, so you can't always match them to be the same mics all the way around. Right, wrong, don't know. You can choose between here or there. No in between. And then, of course, there's balance. If you want a brighter, lighter, more airy sort of sound, you're going to move more towards the horn. If you want something that's just filling the low mids, then you can go here, and it sits more comfortably. Entirely up to the mix as to what is necessary right there. And then, as you've seen, you can control the ultimate output. Does go to 0, which is good. Here. That, as far as I'm aware, is all the plugin does. Oh, apparently you can apply this sizing to everything, and there's some documentation, which I did not open, because remember, I generally try to never open that. The one thing here, but none of the others seem to do anything, so it's like, oh, look, it's an Easter egg, the most helpful thing. But again, all of this just kind of wasted space. Does it sound good? Yes, it definitely sounds good as it comes in, but it does get loud. Yep, that's definitely off. It does sound good, and it does do a pretty good job of emulating a certain amount of the characteristics. Bearing in mind, it's very hard to know, unless you've been in rooms with these things, and I have not, it's very hard to know how well it emulates, because my experience of these things is somewhat third, fourth, fifth hand through Deep Purple records, through Huey Lewis records, which are covered in these things in various different styles, or of course Springsteen records, which are quite often have B3 Leslie combos, but then some of them I think are far newer devices than that. Some of the later things are not necessarily the real thing, and I can hear some of those isms, and some of those isms don't sound the same, but maybe they don't sound the same simply because what happened between John Lord sitting at his thing and hacking away at his keyboard, and obviously me getting it come back off record, and a record that is old and somewhat damaged and therefore imperfect and colouring everything that's upon it. There are some immediate like, wow, this sounds more like than everything else, but then there are some other things where I feel like it goes so far and then just very rigid stop in what it's doing, that there isn't a sort of burring of, it's like, oh, well, it's got this pretty good and then it fades off there. It's like it's got it excellent and then it just stops, which again to me screams IRs, because IRs are like that. They're good in the tiny bit they're good at, and then they're no good anywhere else, whereas an algorithmic can tend to perhaps never be as perfect in any particular spot, but be broader and has a natural fall off outside of its perfect bit, so like bell curve, shall we say, whereas I find IRs are just like a square wave in the sense they're good for the bit where they're up top and then they're nowhere everywhere else. An actual emulation will tend to have a bell curve roll off, which makes them a little easier to deal with. But on the surface, definitely it's got that immediate wow factor. There is that emotive wow factor, which I think we need to be very careful of, in the sense that when we've got this picture open, we're far more prone to feeling like it's more amazeful than it really is. But it's pretty amazeful as such when you first turn it on. I wouldn't know until I put it into a piece, but I just wasn't in the space for writing pieces of any merit or lack thereof for this. I just wanted to look at the device on its own, and while I think that it does what it says it's going to do on the website, it gives you that immediate, safe, perfect, ready to go on record kind of sound. That's actually not what I'm looking for. Despite the fact that I'm looking to make great records, look at all the noise, I'm not looking for things that are so cliched. Because the problem with cliched is that when you hear them come back, or at least when I hear them come back as somebody who's heard the real thing for decades on records, they come back sounding wrong. They don't sound like the real thing at all. They sound like a pretty hack-handed emulation by somebody who has never listened to the real thing at all, but thinks they have, either because they briefly encountered one in a studio, or because they got an emulation that tells them how amazeful it is, and they're like, now I'm amazeful. But if we go back and listen to our Deep Purple, Huey Lewis, The News, Procol Harum, whatever, any of these records that have these kinds of things on it, it's just like, it's not how Hank Williams did it. And it's that sort of sense of being organic, fitting within the world that it has been created, where I come unglued with this, because the whole process seems to be about illusion and delusion, rather than the good kind of illusion of creating another world. Let's say, for example, even though I was never head over heels with it, let's say, for example, Harry Potter. Harry Potter created a big, vibrant world that people got into and they felt was like, yeah, this is... And when you're playing the Harry Potter game, watching the films, it is pretty darn good. But if you watch a B-grade science fiction or B-grade fantasy or whatever, there are massive holes in the world. And it's hard to be as enamored of them. You're more likely to want to fall asleep because there isn't the vibrance in the world. And to me, this feels more like that sort of B-grade kind of approach, rather than the let's build something that's so consistent within itself, no matter how ridiculous, that's so consistent within itself. And that's what older style recordings were about. That's what I'm about. And I feel like if I put this into battle, that I would probably find those solid edges were an annoyance, because they'd be where I wanted to go, or where it felt like the song wanted to go. Whereas if I had that bell curve roll-off of an algorithm, that I'd be more able to go, oh yeah, and find where all the parts in my mix intersect, and create something that, at least to me, felt like a real complete world, rather than one of those B-grade movies where you've got glaring holes in the world, but are able to tell yourself, oh, look how amazing our CGI is. But the story itself, the film itself, the environment, the world itself is like, really? So, bottom line, you're gonna need to try this. Balance its cost against what it really does, but I'm going to advise you to not make a decision on how it sounds when it first comes in, because it does sound impressive. But in its own way, when we A-B, so does this. And that's using a distortion unit which is limited. This does have a smoother, silkier tone, but that wasn't even using nice drive. With a nicer drive, we would get a better result. Just take your time, put it into some real work, finish it up, see what feedback you get from the kinds of fans who are likely to buy your stuff, not other people in groups and forums who are going to be impressed. Oh, look, you used an IR, I can hear it. Because that gets you nowhere. And if you feel like it really is making things better for you, and you can justify that pricing, go for it. But if you find that it's useful to a point and then suddenly it isn't, and that you're struggling with your mixes to find how they all come together, then maybe it isn't really the thing that you were looking for after all, and that there are other better ways of getting there. I hope you have found this useful. My name is Benedict, again, for Higher Hertz. There's higherhertz.com, different stream of information, plus of course all the videos that come through the YouTube here. If you have any broad questions, please not about the product. We are not product support for UAD or their specific device, but just broad questions about the content of this video, the intent of this video, then make sure you're already subscribed and type it in on below. Once I'm aware, I will come over and give you the best answer that I can. Most importantly, get out there, try it, and have a fun day.